excited. I can tell you all got good positive energy. I think it might be the fall air as well, which is so refreshing. The light is so beautiful in Santa Barbara this time of year. So I appreciate your willingness to sit in the dark to look at some beautiful projected images, along with our very special speaker, Daehner from the Getty, who returns to us. You probably remember him from last year and from previous years. But, you know, again, the wonderful thing, and this is the type of day where I get up and say, I really love my job because I get to listen to such erudite speakers, really get into their subjects. And in this case, it's so special for us, not just because, you know, Yates is a very prestigious and renowned specialist in ancient sculpture and iconography, but also because he knows our sculptures so intimately. And we really are very fortunate to have the ability to call on our colleagues at the Getty to help care for our most important works of art, including our monumental sculpture, which, if you haven't seen it yet, it's installed so beautifully at the J. Paul Getty Center. It's never looked so ravishing, and this is really all due to the care that was taken both by the conservation departments and the curators who worked in concert to make our works really look better than they've ever looked before. So we get to benefit from his insights because he considered long and hard the many different aspects that you have to when conserving works of this importance and correcting in some ways some malinterpretations in terms of the iconography and the identity of some of these works of art. But even better is that he comes back next week. So, you know, we get sort of the twofer, which I think is truly enjoyable just because you really do, you know, instead of just getting the sort of skimming the surface version of things, you really get to hear a specialist really dive into their subject. And next week, so he's going to talk about the Lansdowne collection, from which several of our monumental sculptures comes, a very important 18th century collection, which is probably better known to specialists than to the general public. We were just talking about that. But for us, the Lansdowne, that name, it's the gold standard. It means everything in terms of the quality of the objects that were collected by the Marquess, including old master painting, including incunables, manuscript illumination, and also antiquities, and also the interior decor, which exists and is preserved at a couple of museums in New York and in Philadelphia. So, you know, of course, we are dreaming, and if you want to start to agitate and tell people how fantastic this would be, we dream one day of doing a Lansdowne exhibition. So I've been kicking that can around for the last 4 or 5 years. It sometimes ends up in the gutter, but then I reach down and drag it back out. But, you know, someday I think it'll have legs. And very interesting as well is the fact that there's a specialist named Elizabeth Angelicousis who's just published a 2-volume book on the Lansdowne collection, which we're very excited to see. And we're trying very hard to get her to come and speak to this group as well. I also just wanted to remark on a thing that I don't know that it's maybe so obvious to you, but the one thing that I really do love about the long view, the history of art in the bigger perspective, is just the ability to experience different types of discourse and interpretation. And, you know, sort of the methodology involved in trying to look at the very distant past is so intriguing, as we just heard through Ken in his perspective on Herculaneum. And, you know, sort of the whole sense of absence, which is a big part of antiquity and its study, is going to shift dramatically as we move into the modern period. And so I just like you to hold that in your minds a little bit, because the challenge that is presented by having an archaeological record which is only partial means that there's a whole lot of imagination that has to go into trying to recover that which has been lost. And what's so interesting as you march through the history of art and you march into the modern period and then the contemporary era is how the active interpretation changes. And instead you have an overabundance of presence as opposed to absence. And that presents its own remarkable problems. So, you know, I just wanted to make that remark because it is so rare that you get the chance to feel the history of art unfold over such a short period of time. But by the end of it, and we will have a special speaker in Charlie Stuckey, who is going to come and speak to us on May 24th. He's the last speaker of the series. And Charlie Stuckey has a very long career as a curator, as an art historian, and he's written many award-winning catalogs and essays. but he's going to talk to us about the contemporary art world and accumulation. So I leave that with you as the tantalizing endpoint, but in the meanwhile, let us welcome Yates.
Thank you very much, Ike. Thank you, all of you, for coming and welcoming me, your kind words. And last time I was here about a year ago, I guess some things didn't go so wrong as not to be invited back. So I'm particularly grateful to you. Can you hear me good? Yeah. I have one of these lapel mics, and I hope this is gonna, because I'm gonna point out things on the screen. So, can you see the screen okay? Because help me with the light levels and all this. Yes. Good. So I gave this talk I want to give to you today in a way after more than a year that we installed this wonderful group of ancient sculptures from the Santa Barbara Museum at the Getty Center. And I thought this is a good moment to reflect a little bit about that very project and what we learned in the course of that project, in the course of researching, for labels we wrote, in the course of designing, installing, laying out the actual exhibition in these new spaces, and in the course of physically, preparing and installing those pieces and what happened in the course of it. So what I show you today is only to some degree to my own credit. I somehow present also the work and the ideas and the labor or ingenuity of my colleagues, both here and at the Getty, and I hope I give everyone due credit when we get to it. So, some of you, can I have a show of hands actually? How many of you have had a chance to go to Getty Center and see the sculptures there? Oh, I would say that's about like maybe a third to a half of the room. Great. So you will be very familiar. For everyone else, I will show you in a minute a few more photos of the actual installation. And this morning, driving over from Los Angeles, I experienced, this view from the opposite end, being on the 405, trying to get here. I was driving exactly at this stretch here, which is a stretch that I believe is between the two freeway intersections in the United States that have the most traffic anywhere. And so I was envying, of course, the gods from Santa Barbara and their other, their companions to be all really above it. And I mean, literally above it. And but looking out on it, and we hope with a certain amount of grace for us affording them, that view. To get further into this, let me see. Oh yes, I wanted to get a sense of how this came about. I mean, physically, not administratively. There are many odds and ends that lead to this, that led to this, and the wonderful opportunity to get these loans for a longer term. But what it did for us at the Getty was actually, first it was a challenge, because while we were preparing at the Getty Villa in Malibu for a revamping of all of our permanent galleries, the reinstallation project that is ongoing and will be finished this coming spring, there we thought, like, what, this is great, these Santa Barbara sculptures, where are we going to put them? But the opportunity was great, and to really say, like, this is a amazing collection. It has a lot of connections with our own museum collection, its history. You know, you can compare the patrons, right, Luddington, J. Paul Getty. So we didn't want to miss out on it. And our director, Timothy Potts, who actually, you know, had this very enlightened idea, and it's a bit of a pun when I say enlightened, because he said, like, why don't we use the spaces on the very sort of like outer perimeter of the of one of the pavilions at Getty Center, which we call the South Pavilion. And this here, you see, this is an uninterrupted window. You know, you saw that on the last slide, that floods the space with light, and it's usually a space that is not used for art installations. And you see how odd this building actually is when you look at the plan. There's a Richard Meyer, he built his architecture, and you know, this is the way you actually come in from the courtyard. This would be like this side. Beautiful, you know, trees right now in the fall. And then inside of it, like almost with very little relation to its shell, is this very, you know, rectangular, you know, plan. And these are these period rooms. It's one very conventional museum rooms. It's very jarring because you walk into this modern architecture, and you know, you've experienced this, many of you. But then you end up in these French, you know, the Rococo interiors. So it's an experience, but it's very odd. And I think Richard Meyer didn't really appreciate this so much, especially since he wasn't the one who was to determine what the interiors of these galleries would look like. So, but he designed the space around it almost like a buffer. And this is, in fact, what we did. You know, everything that has this sort of squarish pattern to it, which actually represents the travertine floor. It like continues from the outside. It's almost like an outside. I mean, it's inside, but it's almost like an outside. On top of it is this terrace, where you have that great view of the 5 and most of Los Angeles. Yeah, the smog permits. And so the sculptures are almost like they're outside. And there's no other space at Getty Center, or the villa for that matter, that really connects our environment as much with the art and the collections inside the museum. And I thought it was a great idea, and I wish I could take credit for it, to use these spaces in the ways like that. This could be a great space. It's a very simple, modernist, and you know, kind of minimalist, streamlined space for antiquities, for Roman sculptures. And so here I show you a few, I should say Greek and Roman sculpture, because there's one Greek sculpture in there which I will address in a little bit. And so is the title of our exhibition. And so I show you a few of these, of the views that our professional photographer did. And so you saw that big sort of, you're going around the building. Here's the outside. Obviously, you look at the hills of Bel Air, and you have that travertine floor. And so this begins here at one side of this big crescent, and then you would walk around. It's like in the middle of it with the Lens and Hermes, marking sort of like the very focal point of the show. This is earlier in the exhibition, and then it ends up on the other side. I can continue here. You walk past the Hermes, and you see the torso of the Doryphoros by Polykleitos, and you go further around it here, and then you come out on this end with the torso of Heracles, which we will also come back to. And we put another banner or big panel on that side of the exhibition. You can enter it from both ends. It's a bit of in some ways, a bit of a challenge, because you really have to go through that weird zone of, you know, French tapestries, and then you expelled back into this sort of Richard Meyer world of white. There's almost too much white for my taste. be honest, you know, yeah, these pedestals, they're very wide. They go with the architecture. The effect is that they're read as a piece of architecture as opposed to as a piece of furniture. And I think that was a decision guided by the fact that we have all these French commodes and side tables. And I always talk about it like I'm laughing, I'm not making fun of it, but it's really odd. And you should, just for that, you should go to experience it. So that we don't have to want to have more things that look like furniture. And that's why the decision was to paint these new pedestals in the color of the walls. And now you have that effect that you see how the models actually kind of resonates with the color of the travertine floors. And I thought it's very interesting aesthetically, also because it shows you in an environment like this, you become much more aware how many different colors white marble can have. And I'm not talking about, you know, the fact that they would have been painted in antiquity. That's a whole different topic. But also we have different types of marble, we have different forms of weathering, different degrees to which statues were cleaned or not cleaned as much, and so there's a whole spectrum you encounter, and that spectrum becomes much more vivid the moment you expose these models to natural light. And we do think sometimes of sculptures a lot about being sort of outside in antiquity, and standing on temples and sanctuaries, and then people will walk around it. And there's a bit of a misconception about that. In antiquity, it was more, the marbles were more likely to be inside, like inside a temple or inside a house, a structure that was covered the interior as well as it was the bronzes, and that you would encounter more likely outside, votives in a sanctuary, public monuments on the agora, other public places, honorific statues in public squares. So it's in antiquity, bronze was considered the material that was more lasting. It was considered more durable than marble. So that only as an aside. To point out one more thing, you see here how these windows actually go all the way up. But we use these scrims to cover the upper portion of it. It mitigates the light somehow, and it mitigates the sculptures being hit by direct sunlight, which is really a jarring thing, and it doesn't really, a few random coincidences allows you to see something interesting, but usually it's just too much of a contrast and too much of big shadows. So that helps doing this. And before we install any art in here, for some odd reasons, for Getty Center, this year exists for 20 years. These shades were always sort of pulled down all the way. Like, it was really odd. It sort of goes against Richard Meyer's ideas of that you go, and then you have sort of the ideas that he frames your view, your panorama, and he really choreographs this kind of like the views and the vistas you have. And so this was also a way of really rethinking and re-familiarizing ourselves with those spaces part of that are part of the architecture, and understanding somewhat better what Richard Meyer had in mind there. So I'm also see like this light is extraordinary, and these are the professional photographs. The ones you saw in my title, and this is the ones I took just a few days ago. It's beautiful, clouds that we hardly ever see in Los Angeles. But the light is really the best light we have on the entire site, and that is demonstrated by the fact that and the floors below, exposed to the same side of the building. This is where our paintings conservation studios are. And they are really the ones who work with the sort of the best indirect daylight, and to see the paintings in the best possible light while they are working on it. So that, in many ways, also works for the sculptures. So I now wanted to take a few pieces from the installation that I singled out because there was something that we learned, or we discovered, or we think we know something new about it, or that we maybe changed about it, or we think about them differently as we were used to while they were in Santa Barbara. And it is a bit of it's kind of a truism. And I say, yes, when you have the chance to really engage, physically, it doesn't come out right. When you really spend time looking at actual artworks and in environments that are not in the usual display environment that you see in the museum, but in other moments during like unpacking or trying to find it like mounting them and seeing them sort of in a workshop, that you see things that you don't necessarily notice before. And so it's a plaidoyer, a plea towards, really that is looking and spending the time and allowing you the time to study and observe is rewarding towards what we know about sculptures. And this is why the Getty, Ike was so kind to say, to thank us for the way we install the pieces and how they look good. But in fact, we get the benefit much more from it, because we get a spectacular selection, we got to open up spaces and gain something for our visitors, an entire new experience. But also we got to spend time, and a longer time, more than just your usual loan goes for 12 weeks, and then the exhibition is over and then returns, and you don't get to spend that quality time that we are afforded with the Santa Barbara pieces while you miss them, I think, this is also a way of saying hello to some of your favorites, I hope. So this is the piece that allows us to, this head allows us to call our exhibition Greek and Roman Sculpture from Santa Barbara Museum. Although, interestingly enough, when it was first bought by Wright Luddington, it wasn't considered to be Greek. It was considered to be Roman. And here's something really interesting that came out in sort of recent years of research. This is a file card not from the museum, but from the art dealer who sold this piece to Luddington. And this art dealer was Ernest Brummer. There were two brothers, Ernest and Joseph Brummer, and they are probably the biggest American dealers in antiquities, and particularly ancient sculptures. They supplied the Metropolitan Museum. They would be the one who would buy, for instance, at the 1930 famous sale of the Lansdowne collection in London for all their different clients. They would work directly with William Randolph Hearst and Wright Luddington and other big names, the Rockefellers, to supply works for their collections. And they kept meticulous notes. And this archive, but this archive has never been published. This archive is only now actually been digitized because it's housed in the Metropolitan Museum, and it's accessible publicly and for free, and that you can actually pull up some of those cards. And because of that, we learn a lot about what we call provenance, and it's a big thing ever since we started looking into Nazi-era provenance of artworks, and it's a particular challenge. Ike mentioned it in her introduction, to do that kind of research for antiquities, where we have big gaps of ownership. There's almost, there's very few pieces out there in the world that we do have a continuous, uninterrupted documentation of who owned it and where was it at any given time. The bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Square is one of those pieces, and there are not many more. I showed it last year, if some of you may remember. Now, this card from the Brahma archive tells us a lot, and some of it we knew, some of it we didn't. In many cases, even Santa Barbara didn't necessarily know where Luddington had bought his pieces. And so we can see here exactly he's sold. It says sold to Wright S. Luddington, January, cross out, October 15th, 1937, for $385. And then it repeats this here, and then it says other things that they sold to him at the same time. And then it says, okay, and the title of this work given, the identification, head in marble, Roman copy after a 5th century head. And that is more or less fair assessment. Oh, then it says life size. I'm not sure if all of you can read it in the last row. So $385 doesn't sound like a lot, and depending on how you calculate it, I actually did it yesterday. You can say in today, this could be in 1937, $385 bought you the same amount of consumer goods that today $5,300 would buy you. So you could still, that's still cheap. But then if you take another measure, let's make this comparison always very tricky, is at that point, for instance, how much gold could you buy, or you could buy, for this amount of money in 1937 you could buy 340 grams, a bit less than a pound, of gold. To buy the same amount of gold today, you would have to spend something like in the vicinity of $23,000. So you see how that, it puts things in perspective. But anyway, so this is how we know, this is where it came from, where Luddington got it, and where it was, obviously, before it came, he donated to the Santa Barbara Museum. And this piece was always labeled on display here, and this is how we had written our labels, first as a head of a youth with a cap. The cap was identified as a Phrygian cap. The Phrygian cap is a soft kind of cap, and it's something that is sort of known for figures mythological and that come from the east. Phrygia being a region in Asia Minor, today's Turkey, and sometimes we see them, sort of like certain people, like also Persians wear this kind of cap, or like archers can wear this kind of soft cap, and that has sort of a lower sort of excess tip in it that falls over. But we looked at it, and we thought that it might be, instead of a youth, this might be in fact an Amazon. And Amazons are depicted often with either kind of a helmet, like the one on the right here, it's actually a Greek work from the Temple of Hera on the island of Samos, and or this kind of the very kind of cap. And I thought, the Amazon makes a lot more sense. I mean, it gives you a better idea of what the identity of this head is. And so we agreed to label her like an Amazon. So we have a sex change, and we have a new name we can call her. Amazons are also depicted in other ways in antiquity. You think of the famous Ephesian Amazons, where sculptors competed who does the best image. They have no headgear whatsoever. Also from the classical period, we're talking the 5th century BC. And today, what do we think of when we think of an Amazon? I forgot to put it up. I want to put up an image of a Wonder Woman. So we have an idea, Wonder Woman, this is sort of like the Amazon, and it comes pretty close. Anyway, so an Amazon, but also we agreed with earlier assessments that this piece, and this is the way this is installed today in our galleries, we straightened her up a little, and we agreed that this was actually a Greek work, a work from the probably the later 5th century BC. So we're talking about 430 around the time to 400 BC, the classical period, the period right after when the Parthenon was built, and so this was very interesting. So this. If Brammer had known this, that this was a Greek head, this would have been more than $385, even in 1937. But I think this is significant because I think it's also and it makes this a really important piece in the collection overall, because we don't have as many Greek original sculptures than we have Roman ones. And just look at the numbers of the Santa Barbara collection or the Getty's collection. Tells you that. And so this is significant in and of itself. But then, we wondered, where would it, the Greek word, where would it come from? Why did, there's not, how did it get where it is? And if you turn that file card from the dealer around, it actually says here, it says there, received from Giandolo. And then it says when, in May 1936. And Giandolo is a known name in the art world of that time, and he was a big antiquities dealer, Ugo Giandolo, in Rome. And he sourced many of his pieces actually from, what he had to sell was from Italy or from around Rome. And you cannot ask me how he got a hand on, some of this material, because we don't, well, I don't know that, we can research that further, but we haven't. But he operates out of Rome. So this is significant insofar as that we have a piece of Greek sculpture that most likely comes from some excavation in Italy or in and around Rome. How unusual is that, especially if it's a sculpture that, it's like, what did we say, late 5th century BC. We have cases like this. We do have, and I'm spinning here kind of an hypothesis for you that is sort of some idea I had that I haven't really researched deeply enough or published or anything like this. I have floated it with some colleagues, and I'm floating it with you as sort of my wacky idea. There are instances, a number of instances, where we have Greek sculptures, original Greek sculptures in Rome. They were brought over from Greece, like Ottoman, they were already like antiquities. When the Romans started to collect in the 1st century BC, for instance, and sometimes, in the time of conquest, 2nd and 1st century, they just sort of, raided sites in Greece, brought things back, and then in the 1st century there's a real trade developing where patrons wanted to have Greek sculpture. That was the thing to have. And so these pieces would come from sites and sanctuaries in Greece, and then would be brought to Italy and brought to Rome. And there is a number of examples, and I show you one, which is the pediment. These are these pediment figures from a temple in Rome. The temple was erected in the 1st century BC, the beginning of the empire, and this is like just at the base of the Capitoline Hill, next to what is the theater of Marcellus. That is more or less still there, and and this temple is called the Temple of Apollos Oceanus. It's been known for Apollos, so Sosius was the one who dedicated it, and 3 columns have been erected here. And this temple contained a relief, a frieze, that was open before the Augustan period, but then also it reused some of those classical Greek figures. They must come from some site in Greece, and they were brought over and then incorporated in this new building, like a form of they might call it a spolia, but it's a reuse of Greek sculpture in a Roman context. And I show some, and it's very fragmentary, and it shows actually figures of Theseus and Amazons. Here the fragments of their riding on horses, and then there's a figure of Victory in the middle, and there's an Athena torso. This is the face of what we think was Victor or Nike, and here is Theseus fighting the Amazons. And in fact, I want to spin this as far as suggesting very cautiously that there is a chance that the Santa Barbara head may actually belong to this very same group of sculptures and their pediment. And one of the reasons is not only like that the style fits and the size fits, and the whole story is like, coming out of Rome seems to fit, but also that we have these technical phenomena going on where there are these cuttings in the marble here, and you saw it earlier on the other side, where other marble pieces or bronze pieces would have been attached to supply kind of these flaps of this Phrygian cap she's wearing, or to add hair or other elements that would have been more difficult to carve out of marble, and then it was supplied in metal, or it was supplied in marble but in separate pieces. And up here there's actually a little bit of an iron pin that we believe is ancient and is still stuck in the head, and it should stay there. And the Theseus I showed you earlier, has very similar preparation. And there were in fact some bronze sort of like strands of hair that were found, and I don't have an image of them, but they were attached here, and some of that bronze is still stuck into these very long slots on the side of his head. That are more like drill holes where more hair was attached. And you can actually get a sense, for instance, you look at the eye, how close they are in style. I also believe that the marble is a match. I don't have scientific proof for this. These are believed to be Parian marble, the island of Paros, and this one, just by looking at it, might be too. So here is my idea. We have a head in Santa Barbara of an Amazon that belonged to this pediment, and there are in fact 2 Amazon riders that were found without their heads, and the excavation that yielded those sculptures happened around in the 1930s. So it's around the time when this was explored, and then maybe there was a fragment, or there might be a good number of other fragments. You see how much is missing that kind of got away or got displaced. They were found elsewhere and not associated with the group. And these 2 Amazon riders towards either end of the pediment, this one and this one, are both missing their heads. And she's missing most of her upper body too. And here we have like the part of the horse head. But so it would be very interesting to see how far we can take my wacky idea. So I'm just presenting it to you, and I thought that was fascinating of how this led me, and thank you for indulging me in this. Another instance where I wanted to show you how important this is to dig into not only into the ground, excavating, but to dig into the history, in the modern history of our collections, into the provenance the ownership history, collecting history. When I say modern, that means everything after it's recovered. And there is this wonderful head of Aphrodite here that is also part of our installation at the Getty. And you will see that here's another one, and now you recognize one of those file cards from Bramah's amazing archive. And this in and of itself, I love it. It's like a palimpsest, where they write something in there's actually something pasted over it from a publication, and then they write over it with red ink, and then with pencil, and then there are more stamps on it, and all of this in and of itself has a history, layers, like the archaeologists like stratigraphy. This is compressed, a few years of the history of a piece. But now what's interesting is that we didn't know until a while ago that this piece also would come from Bramah. It was supplied by Bramah to Wright Ludington. And but it doesn't say it on the card. It says it was sold to some cobbler. And in fact, the head was part of the whole statue at this point. It is the same head, but where's the statue? The statue has been known for a long time. It comes from an English country house collection, Marbury Hall, that was dispersed also in the 20th century. And there was a publication in the 19th century here. And it's very interesting because here you see, opposed to this photo, she has she holds these attributes. It looks like this is an arrow, and this is part of a bow. So they reconstructed her as an Artemis. But where's the body? Here. Where's that? Any guesses? Okay, this, Ike knows it. And this is actually in Florida. This is at the Tampa Museum of Art. And it's really the body that was on which the Santa Barbara head of Aphrodite was mounted. And I blow up this old photo and I show you the head. Now, this is a discovery that was done by our colleague Seth Pavnik, the curator and chief curator at the Tampa Museum in Florida. And he had already found out a while ago and had published, he realized that the torso they have of Aphrodite, that's what we call it now, was in fact, it came from the Brahmas again, and was sold to this guy Kohler, who then, that's how it ended up in Florida and in the Tampa Museum eventually. But he had no idea where the head was. So he looked at it kind of from the other end, and then eventually figured out that this head had made its way to Santa Barbara. And now, what is important to know though, this head is ancient and the body is ancient, but they do not belong together originally. So this may well have had a head that looked very similar, and this may have had a body that looked like this, or fully naked, but there are two ancient fragments, and then they're put together into one sculpture. And so it's not that this head really sort of belongs to this. It belongs to it like historically, of course, but not, originally they didn't form the same statue. They had just broken from it. This was part of a restoration, and it's very common practice to use other ancient fragments. And there was a practice done in the 18th century in particular, where there was a lot of fragments around that restorers, could pick from, and then they would supply this torso or this body with a head that fits in size and iconography, and so this how this came about. So that's an interesting story, but I don't think we have plans to reunite those. But who knows? Maybe some of those can be done actually, like in forms of casts, or in forms of a virtual recreation, and with a 3D scan. There's lots of interesting possibilities now. But it's also important to notice that the rest of these original restorations, I mean, or these 18th century restorations, are still lost. The arms, see here, and the lower legs with the plinth. And if you go back for a sec quickly to the card, it actually says on this card that here it says the head is taken off and is good, but will be sold separately. So Brahma was smart enough to recognize this and say, like, this is a good ancient head, but I can maximize my profit if I sell it separately. And he did. And I think in his case and in his age, that's legit. I mean, today we would look at it and say, like, well, it's the history of the piece. We would like to maintain it to some degree, and we would like to, have that history be, we make this part of this work's value. And there are, of course, really unscrupulous, dealers in the field that did this to statues that were actually intact. The head would be chopped off or broken off, and then it would be sold separately. And that's a real crime. But that's a very old trick in the books, and that's something I believe that happened already in the ancient world. When Roman collectors were supplied with Greek art, and so this is not what happened in this case. I just wanted to make sure we understand that. But he sold it separately, and this is how it got separated. And only now did we find out that they were originally together. And this is a great ending, also because, luckily, both pieces ended up in a public museum. And thanks to that, the collectors had no idea. And I don't think that Brahma told them that he took the head off, but he kept records about it. And I wanted to point out that also this head, being ancient, or an ancient fragment in itself, has a restoration, and that's this bow hairdo that really marks this as a head of Aphrodite. And you can see this here, and I hope you do. You see that it is here. There's like a gap, and you see that it's not continuous. It's not only broken, and also like it doesn't really fit. There's really a cut, and here this area is all. It's hard to see, but if you stand in front of the piece, you'll understand that this area is actually a fill, like some modern epoxy or so, to make this less awkward of a transition. And this looks really well done, because the way the drill holes are done and the carving really tries to match what happens elsewhere in the hair. So the person who restored this head, that would have been, obviously, I think the same person who did the entire figure in the 18th century, did really well. Even the model seems to be of the same or similar type.
But is that correct, generally speaking?
Yes. The question is it correct? Yes. Many restorers get it super correct. So I think, like, for my taste, even we have a case like this from the Lansdowne collection, and if I remember, I show this next week of Leda and the Swan, and she's been supplied with a head we think is ancient but foreign. It doesn't belong to that statue. And often that these restorers, they knew exactly what they were doing in terms of iconography and in terms of like what we call type today. And so this is really the thing, this bow. You can find it also sometimes on heads of Apollo, but it's really typical, one of the typical hairdos of Aphrodite or Venus. So there must have been, I'm sure there must have been something like that on this original fragment, and there must have been a big break or something that they decided to replace it, because otherwise, why would you edit? So now I wanted to come to this wonderful small group of Troilus and Achilles, and I think it's one of the most exquisite works in the Santa Barbara collection, anywhere on the West Coast, for that matter. And we would wish we had a piece like this at the Getty. So we're particularly proud to be able to present it for a while. But this is really, it looks, the size, remember, it's just basically like, it's not much bigger than this. It's kind of a tabletop piece, you would think, Roman Imperial, or in the middle of, I would say in the 2nd century, perhaps. And it's, it looks charming, but it's really violent if you reconstruct it. It's the story of Achilles, the Greek hero, pulling off, sort of lying in ambush, and then pulling off this young Trojan prince Troilus. He's pulling him off his horse in order to kill him. And it's a composition that's very well known. Although we don't have heads, or in the Santa Barbara group, it's easy to identify what myth is represented here, because there's a number of other works that show exactly the same scene in 2 dimensions and in relief, and here I show some of those. Here there's some small kind of limestone relief, terracotta plaques, cameo carvings, and other, there's another limestone relief that show that same group. And you see what happens is that how Achilles, who stands on the ground, he pulls Troilus, he pulls him by the hair, and then he pulls him off the horse. And that moment is really, actually, very interestingly, the way this is depicted in the Santa Barbara group is, it somehow looks like that Troilus already, dismounting the horse, because there's both legs on that side towards the front, whereas in those groups he's still properly astride the horse. And the other obvious difference is that this is the only, version of that very, think of like a Hellenistic composition, that is reversed, where Achilles stands on the left and the horses run to the right. So all the other we know is the opposite way. And one of the most spectacular versions, monumental in scale, is, I forgive the bad, quality photo, but it's this incredible group in Aphrodisias in Turkey, a site and a place known for its high quality sculpture in the Roman Imperial period, particularly in the 2nd century. And this was a group that employs, there's not much is left of it. We have a base, this kind of L-shaped base. We know exactly it was excavated in, I think like in 1970 or something, recently in archaeological terms. And it was placed in what's called a basilica, a big public square surrounded by colonnades. And, but it employs 2 different types of marble. The white Aphrodisian marble, one of the best marbles for sculpture, and a gray marble that actually almost looks blue. That also comes from quarries near Aphrodisias for the horse. And it's an incredible sight. If you have a chance this in and of itself is worth going to. Aphrodisias is worth a trip just by itself, but even with that group, you see this exquisite, this sort of like bended, type of gray marble that is used to hide a great effect. The figure of only the one leg of the figure of Troilus is preserved, and there are some other fragments, a hand, and then there's another. There's part of the knee from another figure that would have been standing here. You see, that's why you have this L-shape. Allows this reconstruction. That would have been Achilles. And here, our colleague Chris Hallett, professor of Roman art at Berkeley, has published this, and he's part of the excavation team together with Bryn Smith, who's worked at the site of Aphrodisias for many years, and in particularly has published a sculpture there. and it's just in a recent publication. And they make the case that they think the Santa Barbara group maybe, the model hasn't been tested as far as I know, but they think in terms of like how it is done and the quality of it and other factors may come from a workshop also in Aphrodisia, so from the same site in Turkey. So which is a very interesting finding. Again, these are findings that are not my own. I'm just presenting them. This is research that just was published, after we installed this group, so we learned more about it. Here you see actually another important example of that group being represented on the cuirass and the armor of what is a full-length bronze portrait statue of Germanicus. That is in the Umbrian city of Amelia. The portrait exists, and other fragments of this statue have recently been reconstructed. And the main relief, look at how much this is actually goes out into the open world, and is on the chest, on the belly of that armor, is that very group. Again, in this more original version, traditional version, with Achilles on the right. And now, looking at all these groups and what this composition about, we looked at this again and we noticed there was something amiss, because if Achilles pulls Troilus by the hair, it would have been really hard from down here to reach up to his hair. So there was one instance where we thought, how we're going to address this, and we decided to, because the two figures, the amazing thing about this object is that actually two pieces, and they do not connect. There's not a break where they connect. There's no physical connection. So how they're oriented to one another is a matter of figuring out how they should be oriented. And so we experimented with this when we were mounting it for display. And you see here how we in the mount maker's shop we put up the Troilus and the horse, and then here's the Achilles, and we sort of piece by piece, layer by layer, we sort of raised the figure up and then looked at different options and trying to figure out, he has to be somewhere where it's feasible he reaches the hair of Troilus, and think about his head or pulled in this direction. So I think we got sort of close. And then for further evidence of how the figure should be oriented, also in the way how he turns, sort of like he seems to be like turning more like away, sort of like he's pulling away from the horse, or is he more turned towards Troilus. And we looked at the sculpture itself, and it's in a view of the back, and you see this is his baldric in the scabbard, and this piece here, can you see this? This piece is actually the tip of the horse's tail. So when you take this into account, and you see here, you see the other end, of course, where the tail is broken, it would have come over, and so it was, we had to bring this into a relationship that made sense. And that was kind of evidence we looked for. And this is now presenting this group on the same level, on one platform, but not with a step in it, but on a flat top. And so you see like here, sort of that is this sort of kind of relationship between the horse and Achilles that we worked out in a way I think that is closer to where it would have been. And by doing this, we noticed other details that we hadn't noticed before, or I hadn't noticed before, looking at the piece here or earlier, and I'll just point those out. Mainly, you see, this is where the legs of the horse are broken off, and curiously, there are actually, you see there's a drill hole here, and there's actually one that's been plugged, and that's here on this side too, and both leg stumps, there are little drill holes. And this is evidence that this piece must have been already seen some repair in antiquity. Because there's no other sign that these fragments were ever restored or completed. You know, everything is just sort of like the way it was broken. Except for here, there would have been pins. So either these legs, you know, coming out would have broken off at some point because it's super delicate. You see how the sculptors of this group, it uses sometimes these kind of struts here, sort of disguised or made plausible as the branch of the tree. And of course, the tree trunk support itself uses those to stabilize the different elements. And it's still amazingly fragile and amazing how this was carved in the first place. So here, or the other possibility is that they decided it would be easier if we, right from the beginning, would carve those horse legs separately and then pin them to the rest of the group. That can't be decided as of now. I think it might be actually a repair that happened later, because this really looks like actual breaks as opposed to surfaces where you attach something. I think it's possible to tell one from the other. And another interesting detail here, there's remnants of paint, of pigment here around where the knots in this tree trunk support are, where the branches come out. You see it? It's a kind of a pink coloration. I'm standing so close to the screen that it's pixelated, so I hope you can see what I'm pointing out. This is really ancient pigment. And pointing us towards the fact that this would have been a much more brightly colored little group that had a very different appearance than it has today. Now, to wrap up, one of the most powerful, and I mean this obviously in every sense of the word, marbles in Santa Barbara is on the left this torso of Heracles. And it has long been recognized, and there's been no debate, and that this is a torso that is part of a statue that reflects or imitates the famous Farnese Hercules, and that we know in this complete version from the Bath of Caracalla, from the 3rd century, early 3rd century AD, found in Rome, and then brought with the Farnese collection to the museum in Naples, where it is now. This piece is like, if you've been to Naples, you know it, but if you stand there, you would reach like up to here. So, knees at eye level. And this is gigantic, it's a colossus of a statue. And that is one of the most famous images in all of ancient art and beyond, in fact. And there are hundreds of versions in sculpture and more in other arts, and then also in modern art, like the beginning of the modern, when I say modern, I mean begins the Renaissance and later. And the Santa Barbara torso is one of them, in obviously a smaller scale, more like on a life-size scale. And you see also it's much less, it has a lot less bulge, he has a bit less of a paunch here. Or you could say less of a six-pack, but I think there's some slack here. So more tension. And really everything is missing entirely, the limbs, the head. It's a true torso. But looking at this image, you immediately understand what we thought is odd, is the way, we do know that this figure was meant to lean on the club and really sort of resting heavily on that club, and that's why it's actually sometimes referred to as the weary Heracles or the resting Heracles / Hercules. And that the way the torso is mounted is really not conveyed at all. Something else is conveyed there, it becomes something very different. It's like a really powerful but self-confident, proud type of hero that kind of steps up to the stage and is like, I'm ready for my next labor. But in fact, of course, what the statue tells is that Heracles is at the end of his labors. He is really exhausted. And sometimes he's too muscular to stand, And he is he's resting, he's exhausted, and he's holding in the hand that he has behind his back, he's actually holding the prize for the last level of the 3, the golden apple of the Hesperides. That's what's supposed to happen is in this hand. And so what we did was when we looked at mounting the piece, and the reason was not only we just wanted to change it, but also because we looked at the mounts, and in the way we thought like we could maybe improve some of the mounting. We looked at different inclinations and orientations, and we sort of rigged it up. This is in our mount maker's shop at the Getty Villa, and so this was actually, it's not something you just say like, hey, do it like this. There's a lot of this heavy work that not two people can hold it, and like, can you go a little lower, like you make a painting? So you have to rig it, and you have to look at many different things, but once it's rigged, it's actually hard to look at it. And then you have all this clutter in the workshop, and then like you get this, good reference point. So we worked this out together with the conservators and with the mount makers and sort of like that we wanted to get more of the sense that it's really leaning on the club, although the club is not there anymore. So make it more reminiscent of the phronesis, of the resting of a weary Heracles, and making a statement that is more in keeping with that famous image. Now, what we did to accommodate this was, in fact, like you saw the earlier piece had like 2 pins, one in each leg stump, this one side was was easily removed, so it allows us to sort of like play with the angle, but the other one didn't come out, and we didn't want to, if we didn't have to, didn't want to force it out. But in order to mount it in this new angle that we wanted, it needed to go into the pedestal at an odd angle. And that's always like a difficult thing if you wanted to mount this, securely. And our mount makers came up with 2 things to achieve that. One was to use a kind of interface that on its top side, it's this piece here I talk about. The top of it is cast, so it conforms to the break surface here of the model, and the bottom sits flush with a certain amount of, and it has to have a certain amount of footprint in order to work, because it takes a lot of load. Sits flush on the deck, on the pedestal surface. And then, the hole had to be drilled a little bit oversized to feed this, it's really at a weird angle that goes in. And under the pedestal top, you look, see there's a steel plate, and under it, they use this kind of big washer, doesn't really describe it, this kind of cylinder, and it cut it at an angle that reflects that angle, and then we're able to tighten it this way. And together with this, and then this device, we're able to actually mount it and get away with only 1 pin. And that really helped the whole appearance, we believe, of the torso. And that is actually a relatively simple solution after all. But it took a while to figure this all out, and it's really due to our engineers, and that's how I call the mount makers. They're conservators and they're technicians, and they're actually, in many regards, engineers. And this is when it's actually done, and we propped this up. We mocked up this for pedestal height and how we wanted it to be displayed later, and the result is still simple in comparison. See how much the angle has changed. We could lean even further, for my take, but then it became an issue because it's still like the torso is sort of by itself, and I think it now has a moment where the clavicles, this line here, right, is already leaning. It's leaning this way towards the club, and that conveys the posture very well. The color, we didn't change the color. Okay, it's just my camera didn't pick up. This was the only piece that is actually as it is installed. Remember that this pedestal is supposed to be white. That's what it is. It's a white pedestal, but it's the only piece that doesn't have as much daylight as the others at the end of that hall, and that has more artificial lighting on it, and my camera didn't translate this very well. So no, we didn't tint it in a new color. And so I wanted to, but it's very interesting, it's like walking around and then learning things about it. I even now start to see more things that I hadn't noticed before. And people are always curious, like, so what happened with the genitals, right? It's like they just break off, you're used to this. But if you look closer, we actually notice that this is the way it's broken off. It's very regular. It's very, smooth. And I think it's a possibility that this was mutilated at one point in antiquity. That the genitals were carved or hacked off maybe some point, either in early Christian times, or when I say this, I count early Christian as part of antiquity, or in medieval, maybe not in medieval times, or at some point. We don't know. There's not a very long history of this, also not a long modern history, because we see there's no signs of restoration or completion. So anything that sort of to alter it this year would have happened before it got into the ground. Also because this area, these break areas are all covered in the same type of, weathering layer that the carved surfaces have. But this in and of itself wasn't enough evidence for me. But then when you look at the nipples, and the photos don't actually show this very well, both of these nipples are actually restored with tiny little patches. So they're kind of little polygonal patches of marble that are set into the ancient surrounding surface, like little plugs. And the fact that this happened to both and points to me that they too would have been just hacked off at some point deliberately. Because it wasn't so like to me that this was just, who knows, this cannot be by chance. But at some point in, whenever before this piece was sold, someone did restore this, and there are others that kind of little marble patches that you see to take care of bigger gashes or breaks in the surface. So that just one of those observations that there's a possibility that this piece was attacked. In particular for its more sexual elements of it. And so with this image, I wanted to lead us out and show another view of Lansdowne Hermes, which I'm not addressing today, but Eric Rissel, the conservator who worked on it, presented it here a year ago, and some of you will have heard his talk. Next to my reference to White Luddington for being such an enlightened collector, who was not only into ancient sculpture, but also into modern art, what at his time was contemporary art, collected Picasso and others, would have been maybe pleased with the environment in which his ancient sculptures are placed for the moment. And thank you to him. Thank you for being so enlightened to donate these pieces to the Santa Barbara Museum. And thank you to the museum for letting the Getty have a bit of that glory for some time. Thank you very much.
Have time, thank you.
I have two questions. First, you said that the gray horse was excavated in the 50s. Was that all that was there? Or, how did they know that there was all these other things going on?
Let me go back. The question was about the gray horse in Odysseus. See if I can find it quickly. There it is. So there are, go back to the big screen. So you see how the reconstruction actually goes further. It has this, look at this, there's like an animal hide that sits over here. There are these reins and other elements. This was actually, let's say this was reconstructed based on the treatment of the surface. This photo really doesn't show it, but there is an area where the surface is roughed up. So there would have been, this would have been done most likely in metal that was wrapped around the horse. None of this was found. That was probably reused at some point. It's just metal. But this is the extent that was found is like, yes, they found this space in the place where it was set up. That's the beauty of that site. That it has never been filled over with a modern settlement, but you can really find things where they would have been displayed. They found most of the horse, and I think that's the extent of it. In that blue-gray model, they found this, being the left leg of Troilus, and then they found bits and pieces, I think one hand in white model, and then I think a knee of another figure and I think it was another left knee, so they knew it was another figure, in white marble that would have been part of Achilles.
So this drawing is sort of creative based on what's probably...
That is based on two things. It's based on like the other images that I showed you, to some degree, because we know that composition. But it's also mostly guided, and in the publication there's a good view of it, of actually this base. You see how this base has this peculiar shape, this L shape, so it makes room on this side for another figure. And you actually see there's areas that are lowered into the base. You see like almost like footprints with holes to attach things here. Sort of like lowered into. You see like these outlines here. These actually all based on markings and carvings on top of the base. So that really also guided this and proved. I think it was very much the base that allowed people to see like there was another figure next to, standing next to the horse. So what could that group have been? It's more or less easy. You have both parts, which is amazing, because why did they not get separated? But here, this could have been just some rider, right? But with that base and that cutting in the base, this led the archaeologists to see what was going on here. And the hind legs of the horse, those would have been also you see like there's some footprint of a small plinth attached that would have been here. But I don't think these elements were not found. But,
so this is fascinating because the orientation, because you have these intersecting planes, the dynamism of interaction is so different. Is it possible that our group is not really supposed to be quite so planar? I mean, is it possible that they attach at a jauntier angle, so to speak?
that's actually a good question based on this evidence. And if you go back to it, or like maybe the way we then, I have a view that's a bit from an angle here. There's actually more third dimension to it than you often see. We went by a number to determine let's say the rotation or the position of the Achilles figure. And there are other of these like kind of little struts that you see that are broken off. There's like attachment points. You have these little marble bridges between the horse and his body, and also like there's a piece of, for instance here, then you see his mantle. He Troilus wore a mantle and that hung down in the back and sort of attached somewhere on the horse. You have these little bits and pieces that you use for evidence. And I also think that I mentioned it looks like a tabletop thing. It probably was a tabletop thing. And as such, first they changed the whole they changed the orientation left to right. And I think it was made into a more, a bit more of a relief-like composition. The way we actually see it on some of the reliefs, on many of the reliefs I showed, because they didn't have that choice. But we could revisit it if you make the horse tail longer. If you make that claim, I think the thing is you can now play. This just pivots on this thing. You can just have this one pin. You could just try to sort of like. It's not set in stone. I mean, this is something that you can. This is metal, wood. Yeah, okay. So you forgive the pun. So you can. This may not be the last word. I think the last word for this could be if you have someone try to model the missing pieces in between, try to model how the arm came up, and then you would have to model a head, or then connect the tail. But you're right. There is a chance that it's notable how much Achilles actually seems to pulling, but he also seems to even turn in the opposite direction, which I think is great, because you get to actually see more of that tension, because he turns that way. So, Mary.
I saw an exhibition where the head of an Antinous they found the head somewhere in the they were putting it. How much of that kind of work is going on right now, trying to reconstruct the missing head, the missing body, or the face of one side, and trying to make whole these things that have been trying to
And getting dispersed. You mean? Yes, this is the question of what we call dissecta membra. So parts of an object or a figure that got dispersed and end up in different places. And this is work that's always going on. I think there are some people that may specialize in it. And I have always a few in my mind, not always, but I have a couple of pieces in my mind that I'd like to actually go and prove that they belong together. And the easiest always if you have the break, and then you have the break and it sits there and there's no question about it. And it happens every now and then. The Boston Museum had this famous case where there was a figure of Heracles, a torso, it's just an upper body and a head, and then at a site in Turkey, in Pergam, I believe it was, they found a lower body of a Heracles. And then it was shown that it actually matched, so that the upper body that got away in the upmarket and got to the Boston Museum, in fact belongs on top of that fragment that was excavated a lot later. So that led to Boston restituting their piece back to Turkey because they could not have acquired it by proper means. In the Getty, many American museums they deal with that question. So that's always sometimes ultimate proof where something comes from. And there's a lot. We always gain from this because we know, hey, it's nice to have a figure of Heracles in Boston, but in fact, as bad as it is, you can say that it got excavated illegally and then it made its way into the art market and then it got sold to museums. But in the end, by this find, even though the torso goes back to Turkey, where it's also in a public museum. But we know more about it. We know where it comes from, we know where it was displayed, we know a lot more, so there's much to be gained. So yes, and often these things that they happen by, I don't think that people are really setting out to find it, and sort of let me match up things. But the moment you concentrate on a particular composition, on iconography, figures of Achilles or something, you start looking and you look at all the available material, and then people happen to notice because they belong together. And sometimes it's a bit of a guess, like I did with, of course I would have liked the Amazon I showed at the beginning to really fit break to one of the figures in the temple pediment, but it doesn't. So there's still room in between, which allows me to say maybe. Yes?
So how did the Roman brothers acquire their arcs that they then sold to people like Wellington and others?
You mean which brother?
The Roman brother art dealers.
The Brahma brother.
Yeah.
Yes, well, that's a good question. We sometimes, well, obviously, in the Amazon case, we know because he says he got it from this Roman dealer. He got it from Giandola. And so it was Italian dealers who supplied American dealers with their artworks, and that's how it has been for a long time. And where these Italians in those days, obviously, and until recently, where they got their pieces from, they wouldn't say, or if it was old piece from old historic collection, that's the irony. Lansdowne pieces in Marbury Hall, these British aristocratic. We, in many cases, 18th century, we know where they're from. They're from excavations that we know that some of the people at the time were making particular sites, Villa Adriana and elsewhere. So we know where they're from. In the more recent, after the export of antiquities became illegal in Italy and in other Mediterranean countries, then dealers started to conceal where they got their things from, because they had to channel them into to get them to be able to get them out of the country, or there's all sorts of story how long and sometimes painful history that quite a few American museums are going through and figuring out, this is what happened. And we had pieces in the collection that we figured out were excavated not by proper archaeologists, but by people who just supplied the market, and then had to deal with it, or pieces that were stolen from other collections. So that's now it's become standard to look at document that they need to have a certain minimum standard of documentation before we're allowed to even pursue a new acquisition. So that's so where did Brahma get that would be the next chapter of a long history, to know where they sourced their material from. Yes, you would.
Well, are we able to determine if the head and the body of the Aphrodite came from the same piece of marble?
That, I believe, has not been determined. The question was whether head and body of the Aphrodite are of the same piece of marble. I mean, they're not the same piece of marble. They have nothing to do with each other than one is the restoration of the other, although both are ancient fragments, but they were not originally together. They could still be of a very similar type of marble. And if the restorers, they're sometimes really good in finding marble that sort of like matches the original, because they wanted to create the impression that there was much more to the ancient substance than there was. And yes, so yes,
Me, is this orientation of the figures up there on the screen unusual, this orientation to the left?
You mean that this year,
That most of them are on the going to the
going to the other. Yeah, this is unusual. That's the only instance we know where this is going in the opposite direction. And maybe that was a way of, maybe it was commissioned for a particular place in a particular room, and it made sense to sort of turn it around. And the other things that I pointed out that are different, how it looks like that Troilus already sliding off, so he has both legs on that side. So everything is more like a prospect, maybe unfolds a bit more like a towards one side, so you see it all in one view. Even like his leg, his other leg, that in the other groups, I'm going the wrong direction, is astride, and you wouldn't see, So there's other adjustments that were made here too. But that's the conventional way of showing you. You see the foot of the other leg, but he's still astride. So he looks like he's a bit more complicit in dismounting, but yes, please.
This strikes me as a very unusual arrangement between museums. Ordinarily, when you enter a work of art, you expect to get it back in the same condition. Obviously, that's not the case. What was the deal between the two museums? Getting general much more expert.
No, I think maybe I could ask the question.
It's actually not that uncommon for museums to collaborate, especially in areas where we don't have the same expertise, and we certainly don't have a conservation department with our historical, or we don't have our conservation department in the near future. So it really just made a lot of sense. Since the pieces have been treated for quite some time, Jerry and I also directly getting there, like our Hermes many years ago, but not to the satisfaction. So it was really an opportunity to give the staff the time to really devote, as Ian has just described, to figure out how best to treat these objects. So it was pretty much a win-win situation, and we do have that agreement with the Getty, as other institutions do, where they will accept works of art from another museum and display them on the understanding that we also get to benefit from conservation of the pieces. And we have paintings that are on long-term loan at the Getty, or master paintings that we otherwise wouldn't be showing, and that's part of our kind of reciprocity.
Yeah, that's a kind of a tested way of a partnership, and the Getty engages in this not only Santa Barbara, but museums worldwide, where what we can offer is facilities and resources and sometimes expertise, particularly in the field of conservation. And we get, and in some museums, like the Naples Museum, for instance, we've done many projects over the years, as we've done a string of projects with Santa Barbara that builds that partnership, where we get to, I was thinking we benefit twice. We get to, the fact that we get to, yes, work on something that another institution trusts you with, like, you treating it right away. And then we often get to display it and host it for a while in our galleries. So this is something that's not that unusual. What I would say is unusual with some borrowers that we really got a lot of trust in many of the steps we've taken, so you didn't have to bring in a whole committee that had to decide if what we suggested was okay or not okay. So there was very much, there was a great openness and a great, I think, understanding on some Barbara's part of what we do and how we do it, and I think there was an agreement that is a good way to do it. It doesn't mean that we didn't ask for permission when it came to certain points where we didn't foresee a certain, some treatment, some modifications, some new mounting that we wanted to do. We would say, hey, this is what we found, this is what we think we can do. What do you think? Do you want us to do it? Or so there's a very, it goes back and forth. Very productive and very rewarding, mostly for us.
So he's coming back next week, so you'll have the chance to revisit with him.
Probably don't need this one to get out of this room.
Actually,